And bear with me for a few minutes. I'll try to walk you through recent 10, 15 years, because to understand what's going on in Ukraine, you need to understand why Russian government can do what it does, and why the political equilibrium is so much connected to economic history of the last 10 or 15 years. And basically, the economy is now not growing. It is actually stagnating. And this is a big difference from the first 10 years of Putin's government, starting in 1999 and ending with the crisis of 2008, 2009. At that 10-year period, Russian economy was growing at 7% per year average. This is a most outstanding decade in Russian economic history, even including industrialization in the 1930s, when the economy was not growing as fast. And what has contributed to it? Well, first, it's luck. A lot of people would talk about Mr. Putin's main strength being lucky and fortunate. He came exactly at the right moment when oil prices were low and started to grow and kept growing for 10 years. He came at the moment when unemployment was 14%. It's now 5.5%. He came at the moment where it was a lot of spare capacity, slack in the economy, which was with the growing oil price getting back to normal. And that, of course, helped to fuel the growth. But it's not, of course, the only story. Russian economy at that point was reformed, privatized, more competitive than it was before and than it is now. And with the money flowing in, it actually picked up and recovered really quickly. And then I should give credit to Mr. Putin, who introduced a number of reforms in microeconomics, deregulating the economy, improving property rights at that point, and also introducing macroeconomic stability. Russia balanced the budget. Russia repaid foreign debt. Now foreign debt of Russia is 10% of GDP. This is the lowest among largest countries, among emerging countries as well. And that fueled growth. That brought investment, foreign investment including, and the growth continued. And Russian public, of course, was very happy to see that. And that explains Mr. Putin's popularity, which continues today. You can actually break the data month by month, and you can see that economic performance is highly correlated with support, approval rankings of Mr. Putin. Now, that all changed in 2008, when Russian economy collapsed by 8% in 2009. And then it only recovered first at the 4% a year, and now, and then at 3% a year. And last year, 2013, the official data are 1.3% a year. So the slowdown actually started pretty much after the economic crisis. First recovery was going on backed by consumption. Consumer lending, for example, non-mortgage consumer lending grew by 40% in 2012 and by 30% in 2013. So consumption was actually growing. This source of growth is probably exhausted by now. The other things which I mentioned, oil prices, which are high but probably not going to grow for a while, the spare capacity, the cheap labor, all that is gone. So it is not surprising that the economy is stagnating. What is surprising is, given that it's not rocket science, to what extent Mr. Putin and his government are not doing much about this. In this country, you sometimes say it is the government which is the problem. And it is exactly what investors in Russia and outside of Russia think about Russian investment climate. When John was moderating a panel in Davos a year ago, he asked the audience, out of 5 possible explanations of Russian economic problems, what is the most likely? Out of 5 questions, 80% of people in the audience in Davos plenary session, 80% said governance, which is corruption, which is expansion of inefficient government companies, which is a non-accountability of the government. And with the popularity that Mr. Putin enjoyed over these years, he managed to renationalize the commanding heights of Russian economy, and somehow he didn't bring corruption in check. Corruption has grown, and still he continued to be quite popular. Investors didn't like that. Investment today in Russia is still below what it used to be in 2008. And it's also actually falling. And the stock prices are low. So there are some facts and figures in your books where you can see that PE, price-earnings ratios for American companies are 20. As you probably know, emerging markets on average have 12. In Russia, before the war, it was 6, and Gazprom was trading at 2.5 annual profits, right? So investors don't like investment climate in Russia. And they are taking money out. The capital outflow, of course, was very high during the crisis. Then the situation reversed. And then the capital flow returned to Russia in 2010. And it was not clear why, because Europe was in trouble, US was in trouble in 2010, and yet investors were taking money out of Russia to Europe. First, the explanation was that it is Moscow mayor who is fired and his wife is taking money out of Russia. His wife is the richest woman, coincidentally, in Russia, was at that point involved in construction sector. And so the idea was that the first 10 or 15 or $20 billion of net outflow can be explained by immigration of a Moscow mayor. But then afterwards, people started to say, maybe that's too much. Maybe we need to think about other explanations. And then people started to think, well, in 2011, there will be an election. In 2012, there will be an election. Maybe there is a political instability that investors are afraid of. Election happened. We now have scientific evidence that it wasn't honest. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk about that. But after the election, it turned out that investors are unhappy about political stability much more than they were unhappy about political instability. And in that sense, we are arriving today at the situation where everybody understands that investment is low, and this is exactly why Russian economy is stagnating. And investment is low because government is a problem, because government is unaccountable, large, omnipotent, and not benevolent. And in that sense, it is not surprising that the economy is stagnated. Now, the question is what's going to happen with that and why this is connected to what's going on in Ukraine. And the simple explanation is that Mr. Putin was popular and his social compact with the population was, you're living better and better every day, leave me alone, I will do what I want. And that was the social compact, and the Russian population was very happy with that. But this is now gone because income stopped to grow. 7% growth is one universe, 1% growth is another universe. And that 1% may become zero, actually, in the first quarter of this year. And so Mr. Putin needs to come up with another offer to Russian public. And this offer should include some non-material values. And his offer is, how about we have an ideology? How about we have an external enemy? How about we don't care about the money that much, but we care about something else? Great Russia. How about we stand up to the West, which is imperialistic? So we are the only power that can stop Americans or Europeans from interfering here and there in different countries in the Middle East, for example, or somewhere else. And this is exactly what Mr. Putin is selling to Russian public. Now, it is not as easy in the sense that it's not only brainwashing, but also bribing and repression. Condi said, I'm a brave person. It's easy to be brave when you live in Paris. But there are some people who are in jail for going to the street and expressing their opinion. One person I know probably best is Alexei Navalny, who's under house arrest. And this is the guy who apparently has done nothing wrong, because if he would have done something wrong, that would be proven. And now all the accusations against him are completely laughable. And then on top of that, there is outright censorship. And this is exactly what's happening these days in Moscow, when independent internet media actually closed, including Mr. Navalny's blog, including some other independent websites. And in that sense, the equilibrium is changing. Because even Russian public cannot understand why we need to invade Ukraine if looks like just 20 years ago we signed this treaty that Ukraine is an independent country and has a right to preserve its territorial sovereignty. And in that sense, the reason for many unpredictable things happening is probably going back to Russian economy. It's related to the fact that economy is stagnating. Now the question is, and this is where political scientists in the room would be completely with me, but businessmen usually don't understand why Mr. Putin is not interested in more growth. Okay? So can't you actually not introduce political competition, but instead provide better investment climate, fight corruption, attract foreign investors? The bigger the pie, the greater is your piece, right? So if GDP grows faster, maybe the elite would have a bigger piece itself. This is true to the extent that the measures needed to improve investment climate do not reduce the probability for you to stay and enjoy the piece. And unfortunately, the trade-off is we can have growth, but low probability of the current elite to stay where it is. Or we can have stagnation, and that would be a smaller pie, but a bigger piece and with a higher probability. And in that sense, I'm not surprised that the economy is stagnating. I am surprised, however, that Mr. Putin is reacting in this way. A month ago, I was given a similar talk on the East Coast, and people asked me how he would react to Ukraine, and I said, we don't know how he will react, but he will react beyond expectations. And in that sense, my forecast is right. But I didn't expect anything like this at all, and people around Mr. Putin, only a few people around Mr. Putin actually participated in this decision-making. And in that sense, he surprised us all. And I think one problem of current regime is fighting the media freedom actually has a cost. You lose independent feedback channels. You don't actually know how the world works, what people around, people in this country and in different countries think. And I think in that sense, I think it was a mistake, not only for everybody here, but also for people in the elite. And in that sense, I think we are living in very, very dangerous times. And I'll stop here. That it's not only the middle class that benefit from the growth. The growth did trickle down to everybody. And Mr. Putin enjoys this support because Russians live as well as ever in terms of consumption, in terms of lifestyle, and also in terms of their freedom within their house. I think we all know that Russia is becoming more nationalistic and homophobic, but actually within the closet, you can still enjoy the personal freedom. And some very close lieutenants of Mr. Putin are gays, and he's okay with that as long as they don't go public about that. And in that sense, Russians say, compared to Soviet Union, life is so much better. Right. We do have our small freedom space. We do have the consumption. But you're right, it cannot go on forever because expectations are much higher. And something will have to give. And in Moscow, it did change. In Moscow, people took to the street in December 2011 and in 2012. And for a while, Mr. Putin tolerated that, but that has changed. After the Olympics, people who took to the street in May 2012 went for several years in prison, and Mr. Navalny went under house arrest. And last week, or this week, we actually had closures of independent media outlets, and in that sense, his multi-faceted approach to handling this challenge is people who are not afraid and who are informed, for them I have repression. People whom I can convince that all economic problems are due to Americans conspiring against Russia, for them I'll try to use propaganda. And people who are thinking about that situation is not going to be sustainable, and we need to think about some other solutions, I'll try to bribe them. And one other thing is a lot of people of upper middle class just live too well. Not just well, not just IKEA, but more like Bentleys and Rolls Royces. And Moscow is in some recent years, Moscow would be the champion in terms of number of billionaires, more than New York or Shanghai. And it is actually a very expensive city. So it's, he's worried about this question as much as you are.